Hello, my name is Lindsay Mason, and I'm going to discuss an AA meeting that I observed with an interpreter. And this is my analysis related to the medical mental health setting category for our project. I'm going to start off with a summary of the observation. It occurred on Sunday, October 25th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. It was 1 hour long, and it was an AA meeting that was located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Typically, this is an AA meeting that is in person, but because of COVID regulations, it is only online through Zoom as of right now. After the observation, I met with the interpreter for an additional hour. He has been an interpreter for many years, over 20 years. He has interpreted for AA for over 20 years. He interprets for the University of Minnesota as well. He doesn't do a lot of VRS interpreting. He doesn't enjoy that. He likes the connection with people face to face, even though right now, due to COVID, that is minimal. But he is a very experienced. I know him from a previous class and doing observations through other AA meetings that I've done, observing his work, as well as a seminaries class through the University of Minnesota. He did not have a team in this setting. In the seminary setting, he did have a team interpreter, but he does not typically use a team in AA meetings unless for some reason it's abnormally large and he would have to request a team for that situation, but it's not typical. He is, excuse me. So like I said, the meeting was held through Zoom, remote only, and it had over 70 participants, which in my experience is a pretty large meeting, especially over Zoom. Had various male and female and ages throughout the participants. The interpreter is 50 and he's white, male. They were 5 white deaf consumers, 3 male, 2 female, and 1 deafblind man. The rest of the participants in the meeting were mostly white, but a few other African American and Hispanic participants as well. Like I said, the meeting was 1 hour long. It consisted of an opening prayer. The beginning, I did log on early and they had some short, casual conversations. They call it fellowshipping. In AA, it's just connecting with other alcoholics and just catching up and having that time to collaborate in a less formal setting, which is the meeting. They also shared the chair who leads the meeting. He shared his screen briefly just to set up the different aspects of the meeting. In my experience, I usually voice these rules and regulations to the Zoom meetings, which I'll talk about in a little bit. They had an opening prayer. The 12 steps and 12 traditions were interpreted live. It was an open call-on meeting, which I'll explain a little bit. Open meetings are just meetings that are open for anyone that's interested in getting sober. So if you are necessarily still drinking, that you can still join these meetings and just be open and willing to try the program. Closed meetings, on the other hand, are just for people that are committed and had stopped their addiction, and so they're pretty open either way. A call-on meeting is where the chairperson who leads the meeting, he picks a topic out of approved literature, most of the time from the 12 steps and 12 traditions, the 12 and 12, or the big book, blue book that they use. So the chairperson will share a topic, read from the book, and then call on people to share. So everybody stays on mute except for the chairperson, and then he or she would call on somebody by their name, and then that person would share. And typically everyone does stay on video. I know for other Zoom meetings it can be really distracting and have less internet connection, I guess. Meetings that I've been on, they'll have 300 people. We meet collaboratively. We collaborate once a week as a deaf and hard of hearing service providers in the state of Colorado, which is very awesome. We meet with the Department of Education, and those meetings can be 300 people, so we do have our cameras off so the presenter can have their camera on and the interpreters. However, this is 70 people, which is large, but that human connection is so important, especially right now since we don't have in-person connections and time to share in that way. The deaf-blind man has some extra accommodations that they make for him. The interpreter has a couple of different screens where he has everybody on one with the chairperson and whoever's speaking. And then he has another screen that he pins the deaf-blind man. That way he could be an extra resource for him. The deaf-blind man, I'll discuss a little bit more, some of the background on that. But he does have enough vision to view the interpreter through his large screen if he's sitting close enough. Okay, so my first DCCRD, the demand is the seventh tradition was being read, including the Venmo and PayPal information. So the seventh tradition is how AA meetings are supported. We are supported, or AA meetings are self-supporting. And most of the time, we don't make money, or, AA meetings don't make money or anything like that, but they do receive some funding for different things like service entities, funding for the interpreters for the meetings, rent for their building. I know a lot of places still need to pay rent on their church, for the church that they're in, the building that they're in during COVID, even though they are remote. Big books, a lot of groups buy big books and 12 and 12s for newcomers that come in. Chips, they hand out chips for birthdays, and those cost money. During in-person ones, they have coffee that they have to pay for. Another really interesting part is that this meeting, when they are in person, they buy whiteboards so the deaf and hard of hearing consumers, deaf-blind man, can communicate with the hearing participants, which I'll talk a little bit more about that because the interpreter is present and there to facilitate communication, but there are usually at least 5 deaf people. So it'd be hard for him to manage going around, and typically they don't use him for that fellowship time in the beginning where they do utilize those whiteboards. Okay, so back to focusing on the demand. So the seventh tradition was being read, and this is a little bit complicated, so I'll try to explain it the best I can. So the seventh tradition, like I said, is very important because it receives the information that they need, the participants from the meeting need in order to give some money to the meeting to pay for the things I just listed. So the controlled interpreter shared his screen to show the pre-recorded video of the seventh traditions and the Venmo and PayPal information that was listed in the text. Okay, so the interpreter, before he had made this control choice, he realized that when the end of the meeting, there was somebody that read the 12 traditions the seventh tradition, and they had a video. The chairperson shared their screen and had the Venmo and PayPal information, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's very detailed with numbers and an email address sometimes. So it gets a little complicated if you just voice that. And so if it's printed up there, people can take screenshots, a picture with their phone. And that's really important to have that information. And because if you're off one, number or letter, it won't work. And like I said, that's how they are supported and funded, which is really important. But because that chairperson shared their screen, it gives the deaf consumer the inability to pin the interpreter. So they were not receiving that information. And especially the deaf-blind man, he could not read that information. And so that was a big issue. because the interpreter pre-recorded him, has the listed steps of the 12, excuse me, 7 traditions listed, as well as another person speaking the 7 traditions, and he could pause it and make sure it is lined up with the man or woman who was verbalizing the traditions. And then while he was doing that in the pre-recorded video, on the other side of his video, he had the Venmo and PayPal information listed in text. I think listing the Venmo and PayPal information is much more effective seeing it printed, because of the fact that even if the chairperson is saying it, it doesn't give even the hearing consumers opportunity to write it down and make sure it's correct. So this is very imperative that it is printed for that reason. And I won't get into it too much, but we had a long conversation about how the deafblind man wasn't receiving that information, and he would often just log off because that chairperson shared his screen, he couldn't see the interpretation, so he would just log off. And so, without being too overstepping his boundaries, the interpreter did discuss, hey, I'm here if you want me to interpret, and going to the intergroup meeting. These meetings is where they can bring concerns from their individual meetings, and it's kind of overseas. And so that's what they did. They went to several different meetings and came up with this solution. In in-person meetings, they have a basket that's passed around to collect donations, and I think the majority, depending on the meeting, of AA meetings are older generation individuals, and so I feel like they are much more comfortable just throwing in $1 or $5 and having cash on hand, whereas this technology is the only option right now for some meetings is using Venmo and PayPal, and it's a little bit harder for older folks to do that for some. And then I know for me personally, being a young person, I don't usually have cash, so I do think the Venmo is more convenient. And this is something we can use going forward, even when in-person meetings return, which is a positive. Another concurrent demand is that a lot of cities have fundraisers. I know my local city has 2 fundraisers a year, which are huge events for AA to collect money for their local chapter. And one of our events is over 500 people, and we raise a lot of money there, and we have a speaker, and it's a potluck where everyone brings food, and it's around Thanksgiving time, and those aren't happening. They can't happen right now. And so money contributions are plummeting. A lot of meetings are having to go into their prudent reserve, which they have to go into like the money that they've been saving that's used for emergencies. The steering committee is another meeting that the interpreter and the deafblind man went to voice the deafblind man's concerns. And like I said, the interpreter kept the boundary between, his professionalism and he wanted to be like, encourage him and tell him to go voice his concerns at the steering committee. But he said, I'm here to facilitate the communication. And they did do that. The effectiveness, I kind of just went through all of that. As you can see, I believe it's very effective. His control choice, he did mention it's a lot more management and extra work that a typical interpreter may not do if they weren't connected to the community as much, the A community, because this interpreter has that 20 years experience, and he's willing to do what he can. He told me that there's a lot of different things they played around with: white slides with black text, black slides. They ended up using black slides with white text or yellow letters to have the Venmo and PayPal text pop out. And he checked that with the deafblind man, and that worked well. So as you can see with all the things I listed, I believe it's very effective, this control choice. And I think I mentioned it below, but the 12 traditions and the 12 steps are not pre-recorded. They are live because of the fact that the interpreter can still be pinned because the chairperson is not sharing their screen, and the Venmo and PayPal is still able to be shown on the screen in that written text form. A positive consequence, deaf consumers, including the deafblind man, has access to the interpretation of the 7 tradition steps and the Venmo PayPal information. The negative is the interpretation wasn't live, which may give less live connection to the deaf consumers, especially since the meeting is remote over Zoom instead of in person, resulting demand. The participant reading the 7 tradition steps was a little off when matching the interpreter's recorded video. And like I said, the interpreter was able to, he actually shares his screen to show the interpretation in the Venmo. And so he's collaborated with the home group members of that group and the chairperson. And so, but he is able to pause it, you know, if the person's running a little behind or ahead. So that just is a little bit inconsistent, but not horrible. So the resulting demand, actually, I said that, was that the interpreter had to pause when needed to make sure that the voicing of this 7 tradition matched his interpretation pre-recorded video. Alternative controls. Another pre-assignment control would be to give the PayPal Venmo information at the start of the meeting. There is a document that they did share at the very beginning of the meeting with the rules of the meeting, you know, if keep your mic on mute, the meeting's 1 hour long, if there was Zoom bombers, what to do, things like that. But I believe that would be ineffective because people are late, so a lot of them didn't even see that slide, and having the PayPal Venmo information at the very end, I believe is more effective because when the end of the meeting, then they can sign off and go use that donation. Also, I believe the pre-recorded video was effective because they need more explanation to what the 7 tradition is. And when they read those steps and that information along with the text of the PayPal and Venmo, I believe is more effective for newcomers coming in that doesn't really know, they may not know what the 7 tradition is. During assignment controls to not show the slide with the video. And I believe that was ineffective because interpreting live using the ASL to show the Venmo PayPal numbers is more effective. Using the chat box, this is actually what I have seen in AA meetings, is where the chairperson will post the 7 tradition information right in the chat box, has the website, the Venmo, PayPal. I believe that is effective, but again, maybe the deafblind or deaf consumers aren't utilizing the chat. It's not there for the hearing consumers either to see it in text, where if, you know, the interpreter shares the screen, everybody sees it. And there's no doubt that people wouldn't see it unless they weren't at their computer. And the meetings that I've seen that use the chat box are a lot smaller and, you know, under 10 people. So that works well for them. And there's not interpreters or deaf consumers. The other during control choice is just to tell consumers that the Venmo information can be found on their website. I think that's less effective because it doesn't have it in print, and conveying that information in ASL could be a little bit more confusing if they are off a number or a letter. Post-assignment controls is to follow up with the deaf-blind man and deaf consumers to ensure that they receive the info. Ask consumers if that worked well for them, you know, what's not working, what's working well. I thought this might be a little less effective, especially since they already had this set up. And I feel like it wouldn't want to always be checking because it kind of feels like it's more about the money. And I think that would be less effective and less, you know, what AA isn't about is the money, because oftentimes I hear in meetings, people want you there more than your money. And so it's really important for people just to come and get the support they need. Okay, that was a long one, but the next ones are much shorter. So the next demand is participants were casually talking before the meeting started. A term used in AA is called fellowshipping. They're just getting that connection, and it's a lot less formal conversations before the meeting starts, sometimes after as well. The control choice that the interpreter used was he did not interpret the conversations. Concurrent demands, turn-taking management, and significant overlap talking was happening, would be hard to manage and be clear. Deaf consumers are typically talking and signing among themselves before the meeting or with the interpreter is common for them. The deaf consumers also can utilize the chat box to chat with hearing participants. In-person meetings, just to kind of give you the perspective, is that a lot of people get there early. It's a big meeting. Someone makes treats. It's kind of just a fellowship time again, and the deaf consumers are meandering around. The interpreter has relationships with a lot of the people, and so he's there to facilitate communication as soon as someone needs it. But there's so many deaf consumers, he's not going to be following them around. And the AA meeting did buy whiteboards that the hearing community can communicate with the deaf folks and vice versa. That was really great. A positive consequence gives opportunity for deaf to connect with other deaf and hearing people personally and independently. Maybe they have some private information that they wanted to share over the chat box, or they don't want everyone to see, things like that. Another reason this is a good time for the deaf consumers to catch up with their sponsors face to face. There's a lot of the sponsors are hearing that sponsor the deaf folks, but they know some sign language or they utilize chat box, things like that. Negative consequence, he isn't facilitating all communication that's happening. Resulting demand participants. So what happened is I noticed that there was some information that was salient, and I asked him about this, and a participant before the meeting was talking, a hearing participant, and announced that she was having a baby. So in this situation, he would just tell them, instead of interpreting, live because of the overlap talking, he would just say, hey, just so you know, this so-and-so announced having a baby. So if it's noteworthy is what he said, he would relay that information. Pre-assignment controls ask consumers what they would prefer. Ask hearing consumers to take turns before they speak before the meeting. So that's another option, but that kind of gives it a more formal time where this is supposed to be a little less formal. So, but it is an option, especially if the deaf consumers preferred that. I definitely think they would make that happen during assignment. Like I said, if it's noteworthy, he makes a judgment call if he should relay that information. For example, the woman was pregnant and she announced it, and so he did relay that information. During assignment, I thought that maybe the interpreter could take notes on the conversations of all information, just quick notes, and then he could relay that information after. I think that wasn't as effective because you kind of lose that in the moment connection that they would have giving responses and things like that. A post assignment would be to update the deaf consumers if they did take notes. But again, I think that's less effective because the goal of the fellowship is to connect, exchange numbers, make announcements, fellowship events that happen, services needed. All of those things would be salient that you would want to share, but I believe that the most effective would be what he did is not interpret. So those are the first two DCC-RD along with the demand constellations. The third demand constellation that I had was the hearing participant is called on. So a hearing participant is called on. The interpreter used the control choice to sign his sign name for that one hearing participant only. I asked him about this, and some concurrent demands is that hearing participant has a very close rapport and relationship with the deaf community. He sponsors many of the deaf participants. His sign name was already set up. They're all familiar with it. Alternative controls. Pre-assignment, set up sign names for additional people before the meeting if people wanted that, deaf consumers, hearing consumers, things like that. During assignment, use name listed on their Zoom account on their screen. Just use that name. I think it reduces the personal relationship that they have, and I don't think it's effective. Post assignment, set up more sign names, ask preferences. Like I mentioned, if they want that, I don't think it's as effective because it should come naturally if a deaf person knows a sign name or a sign name is assigned to a hearing person, so that could come naturally. And if they want to use that, that should come from them, I believe. A lot of additional demands I have listed. I'm gonna check my time really quick. I'm not gonna go into a lot of these. I think the deaf consumer showed vocal affect amazing. AA meetings can bring on a lot of emotion, and he really showed that. And I asked him, if it gets too emotional for him as an intrapersonal demand, does he, get too emotional sometimes? If the person that's speaking cries, does he cry? And he does sometimes, or he'll say they're crying or they're really upset. But it's not his own tears. It is just conveying that information and really becoming the person. But he obviously can't just make himself cry. So if he's not and they are, he just explains that they are. He says it's not really emotional affecting him personally. It's just processing through him. He hears the person, not just the words, but he hears them. He sees the reactions, the body movement, the facial expressions, and is able to convey that information. He said he is able to get that emotion through him because he knows if the deaf person, or sorry, excuse me, any person in the program reads the pages and works the program, it'll get better. So he knows that. Another vocal affect topic was when there was a newcomer that got called on, and previously there was an old timer, someone that's been in the program a while and is pretty confident and carrying the message and posts the book, and he shows that affect through his interpretation. And then they had this woman who was her first meeting, and just right off the bat you could just see him become that person and show through his body language and facial expressions, non-manual markers, just everything. You could just see it, and you could tell he has a lot of experience in this. It showed the nervous attitude that the woman had. He showed that. He said on a in-person meeting that this is really great too. He's had a lot of comments from consumers saying that they love his interpretation because he becomes that person. The speaker whoever's called on will come behind a podium and stand up in front of everybody, which is a lot more formal, and he's standing there and he's able to really connect with that person and show that vocal affect. He said that he hears their voice, he knows, a lot of them, he knows them personally, he knows how to portray them, and that he needs to look and sound different for each participant that comes up there. Hazelton is a recovery program in Minneapolis, and I noticed that he signed HH, and so I assume that's the sign name, so I asked him about that. I have so many other ones, but I will just skip down because I'm running out of time, and I will include my interview questions. I will submit them, and just the conclusion is that I thoroughly enjoyed this observation. The COVID regulations, again, with a lot of our observations, add another layer of demands. So it's beneficial to see that because AA meetings will continue through Zoom even after COVID. They've been through Zoom previously as well, not as popular. The interview conducted with the interpreter, it demonstrated clarity and the insight related to AA interpretations, and I addressed key decisions in the work and the interpreter's reasons for those control choices. My very first experience interpreting personally was at an AA meeting which is really great. I was able to have a mentor who was the interpreter, and I was able to just take some turns and just take notes, and she'd give me feedback. And I actually met one of my best friends who's deaf and is an AA from that experience. Unfortunately, my friend who is deaf and AA does not want to use Zoom. I've tried to give him more resources, and luckily, he does live in Denver, and they have some in-person meetings, and so I have some friends that can interpret for him, and I'm going to make a trip down there a couple of times to interpret for him as well. Um, and I am very grateful I had this opportunity to observe because now I can take the knowledge what I've learned here with an amazing interpreter and take that and share that with my peers in the discussion posts, and then what I learned from my peers in the discussion posts, because I know a couple other people have observed AA meetings, and now I can take that information and this observation and apply that to interpreting AA meetings in the future. Thank you so much.